the Twisted Table Runner, just doing a little impromptu quilt machine binding. So I've started already and I'll just show you and talk you through how to do this. So I'm lining up my binding, which is folded in half. I'm stitching from the reverse so that I can bring it over to the front and machine stitch the binding on rather than hand stitching. So 1/4 inch seam allowance, keeping the binding lined up with the edge of the quilt, of the table runner, and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I will mark with a pin 1/4 inch from the end, just so that I don't go over that point. So come down to the pin, make sure you don't stitch the pin. There it is. And I'm going to pivot, to that corner. Just pull that back up. There is the corner point, and I'm going to stitch diagonally into that point and cut the thread. And then I'm going to pull that back so that the binding, the rest of it, is in line, parallel with, creating a straight line across there. And I'm going to bring the binding back over so that it lines up with my next edge of the binding. So I just pivot that round now. I've got my finger on there holding it. The fold is lined up right to the edge there, and I'm going to start stitching from the edge. Let's just pop that bit down and then carry on stitching along here. So again, I'm just making sure the binding really is lined up with the edge of my table runner. And I've got some joins, some diagonal joins of my binding, which won't affect it whatsoever. So this is just a short end, the top or the bottom. And I'm going to mark my 1/4 inch from the end again. So I'm not measuring, I'm just judging. It is just there. So put the pin across, and then we know where to stop. So here comes that pin, one more stitch, and then pivot so that we stitch off into that point, that corner. Then, when I can pull this back, that anchors that mitre there. So just hold it down, bring the binding, the rest of the binding back over so that it now lines up with the next edge that we're going to stitch. Keep your finger on there, turn the quilt so that we're ready to start stitching again, right from the very end. Don't come in 1/4 inch, but right from the very end. So this is my final side. So I'm going to stitch a little way. Now we're going to join the binding so that there's no excess fabric. We're going to join it with a diagonal seam. So I am going to leave a fairly big gap. So we'll stitch just to there. And I've got a nice big gap along here where I can finish off. But I'm just going to reverse just there. And then I'm going to cut my binding so that it fits exactly to make the join. So you can see how big I've probably got a 12-inch gap along here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the binding from each side. You can see I've got two ends of it here, and I'm going to line that up with that table runner edge and fold it in half, or fold it at some point. I'm leaving, there's a fair gap there, but I'm lining that up and I'm just folding it. And then I'm going to take the other end of the binding and I'm going to lay that along that edge as well. And I'm going to fold where they meet. So just where they butt up to each other. and where they butt up, I'm just going to, on one side, I'm going to pull that up and I'm going to trim on that fold. So I'm just going to cut that off. So one end, there we go, one end is cut off, the other end is still folded. Now what you must be careful here is not to cut through both layers. That's double there. So that just butts up to each other, but with the bit I've snipped off, and this is why you can do it with any width of binding at all, because what you do, you open that spare bit of binding up and you place it on the end that we need to trim. So where the fold is on the end of that one, line that up with the fold, and then we're going to cut here. So it's just through one layer. So I'm going to lift that up, lift, whoops, I've got my finger in the way there. Now let's just bring that back a little bit. So I've lined that up with the fold, and here I am going to cut. So I'm lifting that up and do a little nick, and I'm just going to cut straight across here to the other side. So what you have now, two scrappy bits, but you've got the fold and the extra, and you've got the other end. So what we do now, if you lift those two pieces up, like one in each hand, and then open it up so they're both, the wrong side is facing away, and you're just going to put this one, they're going to put them right sides together. So I'm just twisting one and putting it on top so that this short edge on this side joins the long edge of the binding. Good idea to just pop a pin, because we're going to line that up exactly. Just going to pull this other bit in. This is why you need a big gap, because the quilt or table runner tends to pull the things apart. So with a pin, pop that in along the edge, just for temporarily, and you can see there's the short edge, there's the long. So we've got that lined up, and we are going to stitch from this point here diagonally across to that point exactly. So we'll pull the quilt up out of the way, fold it a little bit so that we can have, let's fold this away under here. We need this piece to make it easy to sew. We need it to be able to lie flat. So where are we? There we go. So now, because I've tucked all this quilt here, I've folded it, and that means that I can now have this piece lying flat to stitch. So I'm going to start at the top here in that corner. I would go down to a small stitch length, so a 1.8, 1 point or 2. Start stitching. If you want to mark this point here, the flower head pin is in the way. I'll put the pin back there. We're going to stitch diagonally right so we come out at that point there. So hold that down, draw a line if you would like to, or just go straight to there. So we've stitched all the way across. I've actually come out right on that point there. Now before we cut, because we need to trim that excess away, every time I like to just test that I've stitched it the right way. So if you just open that out, we can see when I've trimmed it, that is correct. The binding is in place, ready to go. So now, hold that piece that we've just stitched and trim that triangle away, leaving approximately a 1/4 inch seam. And then we want to open out that seam here. One of the few times that I open my seams, but on bias or the binding or any seams that I'm making that are diagonal or a bias, we need to open it out to make sure all that excess is distributed evenly across there. I could give that a press as well, but I'm just going to go straight into it. So now we go back to where we started here, or where we finished rather. Put your foot back down and start stitching. We go back to our standard stitch length of 2.5, and I'm just making sure that is still as straight to the edge as possible over that join there, and I'm just holding that out, and we want this to be beautifully flat. Sometimes you might get the minimal, so I'm just pushing that to the side, a minimal amount of, I would just give it a pull so that you get the tiniest. You don't want there to be a pleat on the front, but there's a little bit of excess there. And I've just gone over the first few stitches so that when we can turn that to the front, that's not going to be noticeable. So I've got all my binding attached to the back, and what we're going to do is fold it over to the front and machine stitch it. But the first thing I do before that is I just bring the ironing board in here, and I like to, from the back, like so, I'm actually going to iron, or just press, just bring that out around the edge. So I'm pushing the, not into the corners particularly, but I'm just pushing all the binding outwards. So I know that that is in place and fully. This makes it easier when you're doing your machine stitching. You can see that the binding is all away from the back of the quilt. And, oh, there's the ruler, that's where that was. There we go. So in there, just side of the iron, pull that bit of thread away, side of the iron, just to push that out. There's no pleats in your binding. Round to the other side, and we've done a little bit. So just up here, give it a bit of steam. But now our binding is all pushed out, ready to be folded to the front and stitched. So let's take that back to the machine, and we'll go back to our, or we were still on the 2.5 stitch length. There we go. And we will turn the quilt to the right side. On this occasion, the table runner. Pull that bit of thread. So the table runner is ready to start stitching. So we can start anywhere. Let's just get rid of these few, all that thread's there. You can either trim the threads off or just tuck them into your seam as you go. Let's see if I can bring you in a little bit closer. Never start on a corner. And we can start anywhere. So these ends of thread, I'm just going to smooth them up so they are actually inside the binding. Bring that over and pop your needle there. So we're ready to go. And I'm looking at the inside of the foot here, being lined up with the edge of the binding. So let us start. Now, because we kept our 1/4 inch seam allowance and lined the binding up with the edge of the table runner, this should fold over in exactly the same width all the way round. So here we go. So all I'm doing is watching the inside of the foot being butt up against the binding, the fold of the binding at the edge, and I'm just holding it. You could go round and put binding clips all the way round, but I'm just holding that, and it gives you stitching that's right, it's quite close to the edge. So I am holding my fingers to make sure that I am stitching there, but it gives you a nice straight line of stitching on the edge of the binding. Okay, so I'm holding that over too, and keep watching that to keep it in a nice straight line. Now, as I'm approaching this corner here, what I like, there's one of two ways to do it, and I've just found another way which I prefer, in that I'm going to fold this next edge which I'm going to stitch upwards, and I'm folding it to the edge of the table runner, put my finger there, and I use a seam ripper to just flatten that down. So push that right into the corner, hold that up, push the binding down, and then bring this up. Unfortunately, I've just got a join in the binding here, which just makes it a little bit more awkward, but I'm going to fold that over to give us a really crisp mitre. And then I'm going to put my seam ripper, the point, into that fold so that I can hold that in place like a stiletto, and because the fold is coming towards me, it stays in place. So then I can pivot because I've gone into that fold. In actual fact, I'm just going to do one more stitch because that join of the binding, that's it, and that's anchored it even better. Pivot around, and then we're ready to carry on with the next side of the binding. So again, I'm just folding that over and keep my fingers just holding the binding so that we get that nice even binding and the stitching level and straight along this edge. So fold it over again and carry on stitching, whatever speed you find preferable. I do like to go fairly speedily. So again, I'm coming towards the end here, and let's just trim that bit off. So I'm going to fold the next side upwards, like so, and then this, now you can see it's a lot easier because I haven't got a join here. Put my seam ripper down into that corner and then bring that over, and it gives me a lovely mitre there. So point of the seam ripper just to hold it. I've got my finger holding the binding, and once you've gone into that mitre there, which I have, that's anchored it down, we can pivot and ready to start on the next side and in the same position. So again, we're doing that stitching, and it just makes it look all very, very neat. So I've got some threads here, just push those into the binding because they're going to be trapped in between. So I'm still watching the edge of that, the foot, and some more threads, pulling that over, holding it down with my fingers, just so that I don't come off the binding, because I don't really want to stop and start. I want this to be a continuous line of stitching. There we go. So I've got my fingers, I hope they're not in the way. I've got my fingers holding that binding down. But as I say, if you want to use binding clips on there, it's just I find then I have to move them. So I'm just holding my fingers to keep that pressed onto my table runner so that I get that lovely even stitching the whole way along, and a nice even binding as well. Looks actually, so that's gone in just a tiny bit there. So this is where, if you kept your 1/4 inch seam allowance when you've been attaching the binding to the other side, it will all work perfectly for you in giving you that even binding on the front. I don't mind hand stitching my binding at all, but when I'm in a hurry, machine binding is so much quicker, and you can just get it done a lot quicker. So again, coming up to that corner, fold that next edge upwards, right across there, even so that you press down a triangle, pop your seam ripper in there and bring that over And again, you have a lovely mitre just there. We will hold that binding in place. I've got my seam ripper holding the point where we are going to stitch to. And once that's stitched into that fold of the mitre, we can then pivot again and continue on our way along the next line. So just holding that and holding the binding, always holding the binding. And there's another little seam just there. Because it's a longish table runner, there are 3 widths of fabric that have gone into this binding. So we'll just carry on along here. And again, we're coming up to the last mitre. So again, fold this edge up. Let's put those threads inside. Fold this next edge up. Flatten that down so that we've got a pointy bit there. Put our seam ripper into that triangle so that we can then pull up the mitre, seam ripper in and meet that next edge. Taking it out now, but keep that in. It will keep your beautiful mitre in place, and then wait till you get into the mitre, and that has anchored it, and we're on the home run now. Just pivot round to the next side, hold that mitre in place, keep your table runner on your lap, don't let it drag, because that's when things happen. If you let it drag, your stitches become uneven and it doesn't flow under the machine as well as it should. So we are stitching along here. You can see my fingers holding that binding in place, and we're just coming up to the very last piece, and that should all fit nicely. And I'm going to, once I get here, I've got about another 6 inches to go. I'm still on the binding. Just give it a little pull, keep that working, and that should meet your start of your stitching, and just go over the first 2 or 3 stitches so you can't actually see where you started or finished. And there we are. There we are. There is our machine stitched binding all the way around, and just give you a little peek of the table runner, the twisted table runner in the blues as opposed to the autumnal. But that's how to do your binding stitched from the back, and it's even really neat along here. You can see that's just running inside the line, and you haven't got to match it up with anything, and you've got a really nice binding on the front. Okay, as I say, just an impromptu one. You can't even see me, but I thought as I got to do this, why not do a little live demo? It's something that you can keep for the future, and if you need to go back and have a look on how to do that. So thanks for watching. If you happen to see me on, lovely to see you, and I will see you on Tuesday. Bye for now.